The Roman army's battle tactics. Wow, they were crazy. Picture this. You're a Celtic warrior painted for war, screaming battle cries as you charge toward what looks like a wall of metal and death. Suddenly, that wall moves, not backwards, but forward, like a living creature with thousands of legs. Shields lock together, swords thrust out in perfect unison, and you realize you're not fighting men anymore. You're fighting a machine. Welcome to the terror of facing a Roman legion. For over 500 years, Roman battle tactics didn't just win wars, they redefined what war could be. They turned combat from chaotic brawls into surgical operations, from heroic duels into industrial-scale slaughter. Today, we're diving into the most devastating military innovations in human history. From the terrifying turtle formation to the psychological warfare that broke enemies before the first sword was drawn. We're exploring how Rome didn't just build an empire, they engineered one. I'm your host, and this is Chapters in History. Prepare to discover why Roman tactics were so insanely effective that modern armies still study them today. Chapter 1. The Foundation. Discipline as a weapon. Before we talk about formations and tactics, we need to understand the foundation of Roman military power. Discipline so extreme, it bordered on the supernatural. Roman soldiers weren't just warriors, they were components in a war machine. Every morning, they practiced the same sword drills, the same shield movements, the same formations, until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. A Roman legionary could execute complex maneuvers in the middle of battle while exhausted, terrified, and covered in blood. But here's where it gets truly insane. Romans didn't just train for war, they trained harder than they fought. Their practice swords were twice as heavy as real ones. Their training shields were heavier than combat shields. By the time they faced real enemies, battle felt easy compared to training. The famous historian Julius wrote, "A soldier who has been trained with the wooden sword will never be afraid of the real one." But it went deeper than that. Roman soldiers were trained to see their unit as more important than themselves. Individual heroics were discouraged. What mattered was the collective, the formation, the machine. And speaking of machines, let's talk about their equipment. The Roman legionaries' kit was the product of centuries of evolution and battlefield experience. The gladius, that short stabbing sword, wasn't designed for dramatic duels. It was designed for killing efficiently in tight formations. The scutum shield wasn't just protection. It was a weapon that could knock enemies off balance or crush their bones. But the real genius was in how they used these tools together. Roman tactics weren't about individual skill. They were about creating a system so efficient that average soldiers could defeat legendary warriors. The basic Roman formation was the Testudo, tortoise. Imagine 120 men moving as one organism, shields locked above and around them, creating an impenetrable shell that could advance under arrow fire. Enemies would watch in horror as this metal beast crawled toward them, unstoppable, inevitable. But the tortoise was just the beginning. Romans had formations for every situation, every terrain, every type of enemy. They had the wedge for breaking enemy lines, the orb for all-around defense, and the saw for cutting through packed formations. Chapter 2. Psychological warfare. Terror as strategy. Here's what made Roman tactics truly diabolical. They understood that war is fought in the mind as much as on the battlefield. Romans didn't just defeat enemies, they broke them psychologically before the fighting even began. The sight of a Roman legion deploying for battle was designed to inspire terror. Picture this: thousands of men in identical armor, moving in perfect synchronization, their shields painted with symbols of conquest. No war cries, no individual displays of courage, just cold, mechanical precision that promised inevitable death. Romans pioneered what we now call shock and awe. They would arrive at a battlefield and spend hours setting up camp with mathematical precision, building fortifications that looked permanent even if they'd only be there for one night. The message was clear: we're not just here to fight you, we're here to stay. But the psychological warfare went deeper. Romans studied their enemies obsessively. They knew that Gauls fought with individual courage but poor coordination. They knew that Germanic tribes relied on initial fury but couldn't sustain long battles. They knew that Greek phalanxes were devastating head-on but vulnerable on the flanks. And they designed specific tactics to exploit each weakness. Against Celtic warriors who relied on berserker charges, Romans would form up in multiple lines. The first line would absorb the charge, the second would reinforce, and the third would deliver the killing blow when the enemy was exhausted. It was like a conveyor belt of death. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating Roman tactic was their use of decimation. When a Roman unit showed cowardice or disobedience, they would be forced to choose lots. Every 10th man, selected randomly, would be beaten to death by his own comrades. This wasn't just punishment. It was a message. Romans would rather kill their own soldiers than accept anything less than perfect discipline. What chance did enemies have against men who were more afraid of their own officers than of death itself? The Romans also mastered the art of reputation warfare. They would deliberately leave survivors from massacres, not out of mercy, but so those survivors could spread tales of Roman brutality. When the next city heard that Rome was approaching, they often surrendered without a fight. Chapter 3. Tactical Innovations. The Art of Organized Slaughter. Now, let's dive into the specific tactics that made Roman legions unstoppable. These weren't just military innovations. They were revolutions in how humans could organize violence. The manipular system. Early Roman armies were organized in maniples, small, flexible units that could operate independently. Unlike the rigid Greek phalanx, Roman formations could adapt to terrain, split to avoid obstacles, and reform on the fly. It was like having an army of interconnected building blocks that could reshape itself mid-battle. The checkerboard formation. Romans deployed their maniples in a checkerboard pattern with gaps between units. This looked like a weakness, but it was genius. When the front line engaged, the second line could move forward through the gaps to reinforce or replace exhausted troops. It was like having a military assembly line that never stopped producing fresh fighters. The hammer and anvil. Romans perfected the art of the double envelopment. While the main force engaged the enemy head-on, the anvil, cavalry or reserve troops would sweep around the flanks to attack from behind. The hammer. The enemy would be caught between two forces and systematically destroyed. But here's where Roman tactics get truly insane. They didn't just adapt to different enemies. They studied them like scientists. Roman intelligence networks would spend years learning about enemy tactics, weapons, and psychology before a single soldier crossed the border. Against the Sarissa phalanx. When facing Macedonian armies with their incredibly long Sarissa spears, Romans developed tactics to get inside the spear points where the long weapons became useless. They would use terrain, feints, and coordinated rushes to break up the phalanx formation. Against elephant charges. When facing war elephants, Romans trained their soldiers to target the handlers and create loud noises to panic the animals. They would open gaps in their formations to let the elephants charge through harmlessly, then close ranks behind them. Against cavalry, Romans developed the caltrops, four-pointed spikes that would lame horses. They would also use stakes and ditches to channel cavalry charges into killing zones where infantry could overwhelm them. But perhaps the most revolutionary Roman innovation was their engineering on the battlefield. Romans didn't just fight battles, they built them. They would construct siege works, bridges, and fortifications faster than enemies thought possible. At the Siege of Alesia, Julius Caesar built not one but two walls around the city, one to keep the defenders in, and another to keep relief forces out. The Romans literally built themselves into an impregnable position and forced their enemies to attack them on ground of Roman choosing. The tortoise in action. The Testudo formation could cross open ground under heavy missile fire, scale walls, and breach gates. Roman soldiers would lock shields so tightly that men could walk on top of the formation. It was like having a mobile fortress that could reshape itself as needed. The wedge. For breaking enemy lines, Romans used the cuneus or wedge formation. Elite troops would form a spearhead that could punch through enemy formations, with following troops exploiting the breach. It was surgical precision, applied to mass violence. Chapter 4. The Evolution. From republic to empire, Roman tactics didn't stay static. They evolved with each campaign, each enemy, each generation of soldiers. The army that conquered Italy was different from the one that conquered Gaul, which was different from the one that conquered Britain. The Marian reforms. Gaius Marius revolutionized the Roman army by creating professional soldiers instead of citizen farmers. These career soldiers could train year-round, master complex tactics, and serve for decades. The Roman legions became the world's first truly professional army. Standardization. Romans standardized everything: weapons, armor, formations, even camp layouts. A Roman soldier transferred from Britain to Syria would know exactly where to find the latrines, the armory, and the commander's tent. This standardization allowed for incredibly complex coordinated movements across vast distances. Combined arms. Romans perfected the integration of infantry, cavalry, artillery, and engineers. Their armies weren't just collections of soldiers. They were integrated weapon systems, where each component supported the others. Siege warfare. Roman siege tactics were terrifyingly effective. They would build massive siege engines, undermine walls, and use psychological warfare to break defender morale. The Siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD showed Roman engineering at its most brutal. They built a wall around the entire city and starved it into submission. Naval tactics. Romans even revolutionized naval warfare. When facing the superior Carthaginian navy, they invented the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned naval battles into land battles, where Roman infantry superiority could dominate. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of Roman tactical evolution was their ability to learn from defeat. After disasters like Cannae or the Teutoburg Forest, Romans would study what went wrong, adapt their tactics, and come back stronger. Final chapter: the legacy. Why Roman tactics still matter. The Roman military machine didn't just conquer territory, it conquered the very concept of warfare itself. Their tactical innovations were so revolutionary that they influenced military thinking for over 1,000 years after the fall of Rome. Modern armies still study Roman formations, Roman logistics, and Roman leadership principles. The concept of combined arms, the importance of training and discipline, the integration of engineering with combat operations. These are all Roman innovations that remain relevant today. But here's the truly mind-blowing part. Romans achieved all this without gunpowder, without modern communications, without any of the technology we consider essential for modern warfare. They did it through pure human organization, discipline, and tactical brilliance. The Roman military was perhaps humanity's first example of true systems thinking applied to warfare. They didn't just create better soldiers, they created a better way of organizing violence, logistics, and human coordination. When you watch modern military documentaries or play strategy games, you're seeing concepts that Roman generals pioneered 2,000 years ago. The idea that wars are won by superior organization rather than individual heroism, that's Roman thinking. The Roman legions were more than just an army. They were a civilization-building machine that conquered not just through force, but through superior systems, superior organization, and superior understanding of human psychology. The next time you hear about Roman efficiency or Roman discipline, remember, it wasn't just about being organized. It was about turning organization itself into the deadliest weapon in human history. That's why Roman tactics weren't just crazy, they were genius.